The reading this Sunday is taken from Isaiah chapter 55, verses 1 to 5. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you that have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk, without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labour for that which does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Listen, so that you may live. I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. See, I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. See, you shall call nations that you do not know, and nations that you do not know you shall run to, because the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you.
Our second reading comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, beginning to read at verse 13. John the Baptist has just been beheaded following King Herod's rash promise to his stepdaughter, and Jesus has heard news of that beheading. Now, when Jesus heard about the death of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he found a huge crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so they may go into the village and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed them. He broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples, and his disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took what was left over, the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides the women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I wonder what makes you tick. What is it in your heart that gives you the priorities and makes you decide what's important? What is it that matters today or this week? And how do you respond when things don't go quite the way you had planned or hoped for? My suspicion would be that many of us have faced questions like that as 2020 has progressed. And in today's Gospel reading, we see something of how Jesus responds when things are not as expected. So we're going to look at the situation he was in, the strategy he used, and the outcome for him and for us. So the situation, as I said at the beginning of the Gospel reading, was that John the Baptist, his cousin, had just been beheaded, following what was probably a somewhat drunken and opulent feast. And Jesus, like many of us when grieving, needs some space. And he also needs to take himself out of the realm of King Herod, because his time, as he would say in John's Gospel, has not yet come. So he takes the disciples. I can't see any other way he would have crossed the lake unless the disciples were with him as his assistants and as those who were the ones who used the boats that they owned. And they go to the other side, away from Herod's territory. But the crowds, as is so often the case in the Gospels, have other ideas. They don't want Jesus to be on his own. They don't want to be separated from him. And so they walk round, almost certainly, although some of them might have gone across, to the other side of the lake as well. Because they like what he is doing. They are impressed with his miracles, and they may even like and appreciate his stories, such as the parables we've been listening to in the past few weeks. And so they head off in search of him. So Jesus is looking for peace and quiet. The crowds are looking for Jesus. And when he arrives and he sees the crowds, Matthew tells us that he had compassion on the crowds and he cured their sick. He heals the sick and he feeds the hungry. And he does so via his disciples. The disciples, ever practical, a bit like me, I'm very inclined to try and think 2 or 3 steps ahead and work out how will things happen. The disciples are like that. How is this possible? Jesus, send them away. There's no food here. I don't quite know where the disciples thought they were going to find food for the crowds in the midst of everything else, but send them away, they say. No food here. They need to go somewhere else. And Jesus says, well, what have you got? And they say, well, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. Other Gospels tell us what use is that among... Oh, yes. Other Gospels tell us that they say, what use is that among so many? And Jesus takes what they offer. It feels to them like nothing, something very small. But Jesus takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he hands it out. And the disciples become the waiters as they take the food to those who are seated. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us how this happened. Personally, I'm not in favour of the theory that says, well, everybody had a packed lunch and when they saw Jesus beginning to share it, they took out their packed lunches and they shared them. I think this is a genuine miracle. And it isn't that they just get a little taste like we do when we can receive communion. We're told by Matthew that they were filled. So I think this is a genuine miracle, a feeding of 5,000 men plus women and children from one person, John tells us, a small boy's lunch. It is a visual fulfillment of those words from Isaiah. Come and receive good food, wine and milk, although in this case there is obviously no wine or milk, without money and without price. Come and receive from God's bounty, God's grace, God's generosity. And this is God's strategy. To give good food, to give satisfaction, to show compassion, to care for those who need it. He gives that which we cannot afford, that which is without price. It is too valuable. We understandably spend much of our time asking ourselves, can I do this? Can I afford X, Y, or Z? Jesus just gives it. Now, I'm not suggesting that that needs to be how we live, but we do need to see that that is how God works. As one who is generous, giving, full of grace and full of mercy. So, where does that leave us? What is the outcome of this for us? The outcome for the disciples was people were fed. They received more food than they could eat. There were 12 baskets of leftovers. And they received from apparently very little. When we find ourselves in situations that are different to our expectations, we're looking for peace and quiet, and the phone goes, the doorbell goes, something happens. And it's someone who we need to stop and be with. We're looking and we're worrying about church finances, our own finances. Where is our trust in God's grace, mercy, and generosity at those times? Are we prepared to show compassion on the needy, to expect him to provide and to do more than we can expect or imagine? Are we prepared to do that as individuals? Are we prepared to do that as communities, as God's people, wherever he has placed us? The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle other than the resurrection in all four Gospels. It is crucial to our faith. It tells us something really important about Jesus. Where does that leave us? Amen. And we're going to have our second hymn, which picks up on some of those themes of desire to see God at work. Restore, O Lord, the honour of your name. And that will be followed by Stephen Jenkins leading us in our prayers.